Hey guys, Pastor Tim here. Hope you're ready for session number 4 of our Bible study series, Growing Through Grief. And today's session is called Resting in God's Goodness. When I question God, I must learn to rest in the goodness of God. And our text for today is Esther chapter 4, verse 1 through 17. Some of the most difficult and persistent questions that come up during times of grief relate to God. All right, those questions are things such as, well, how can God allow such a terrible loss to happen in my life? Or, where is God in my season of grief, and why does he not just end it? Now, we kind of actually covered the answer for those questions in our first session. All right, the reasons we have these seasons of grief is because we live in a sin, curse, and broken world, okay? And it was not supposed to be this way. Now, that answer is correct, but it doesn't really bring much comfort, does it? So something we need to understand, that any believer needs to understand as they're going through a season of grief, is that, we may not know the purposes God has in allowing these things to happen, but we can know with certainty that God's heart towards us and any believer is full of love and goodness, and that his power in our lives will not be diminished. One of the most popular verses that comes up during times of grief, besides Romans 8:28 and 29, is Jeremiah 29:11. All right, many of you guys have probably memorized this verse as well. It says, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end." Now, when Jeremiah penned these words, he knew that Israel was about to go through a time of captivity, okay? Both kingdoms of that time taken by the Assyrians, and then later on taken by the Babylonians. And Esther, as we are going to get into today, happens during one of those long periods of captivity from their homeland. And God doesn't give Israel reasons necessarily for why this is, well, they knew why it was happening, but he didn't give them reasons for how long it was going to happen and why was it happening this way. But what we need to understand when we go through our own seasons of grief is that God doesn't always provide us reasons as well. I think of Job in the Bible. God actually never specifically told Job why these things were allowed to happen unto him. See, the reality is that when we are in grief, what we need most is not answers. What we need is God. And seeking simply for answers is not always going to bring comfort, but seeking God does. All right, so let's start to get into the session here really quickly. Before, I just want to cover 2 attributes of God that any person who's going through a season of grief needs to go back to again and again to remind themselves of the goodness of God. And obviously one of those attributes is, yes, God's goodness, but the other one is that God is sovereign. Now, sovereign or sovereignty, it means supreme ruler. And we know God is the supreme ruler of all, but this also helps us understand that God is in control. No situation is catching him off guard. But the second one, goodness is a state or quality of being good. And we understand that everything God does is right and good. Okay, if we only understood that God was in control, that doesn't exactly bring us comfort, because, if we believe that God was this far off, aloof being who didn't really care or was affected by our turmoil and grief, then he's in control, but that doesn't really bring comfort. But if we understand that the sovereign God who is in control also is very good and desires our utmost good for his honor and glory in our lives, that definitely brings comfort. So our first point for this session is God is in control. Nothing catches God by surprise. The doctrine of God's sovereignty is good news for grieving Christians. It assures that the tragedies and the pain that have come into our lives are not random. He is in control, and he is committed to our good and his glory. And our first point under this is that he is powerful. Now, usually when you go through the book of Esther, you may understand, all right, what the big moment of grief may be for her. Haman trying to wipe out the Jews, okay? But it can be very easy to miss actually all the moments of grief and all the hardships that Esther herself, yes, a queen, had to go through in her life. All right, so let's just kind of think of some of these. All right, and actually I encourage you guys, take time this week to just read through the book of Esther. It's not that long. All right, you could probably read through it several times this week alone, and just kind of think about the context clues that show us, hey, you know what? this is how difficult Esther's life must have been. So a couple things come up to mind. All right, one of the first things we understand about Esther is that obviously her parents were dead. Okay, we don't know when that happened in her life. Was she very young? Was it very recent? But we understand that she was an orphan and she was raised by her cousin, all right, her uncle's son, Mordecai. Okay, many of you are familiar with that as well. When she eventually goes into this, I don't know if you call it ritual or what it may be, but when she goes forward to try to see if she could become the next queen after Vashti was dismissed and so forth, that wasn't an easy time for her. She lost her closest relative for a long period of time, being her cousin Mordecai, and she lost any semblance of a stable home life. All right, it's not hard to imagine the terror she felt being taken from all she knew and then being thrown in and being part of the king's harem. Okay, and the fact of the matter is, guys, if she did not become the queen, she was simply just going to be another one of the ladies in the king's entourage, in the king's harem that he had. Nothing special whatsoever. So there was great instability for her at that time, and there was also great fear and anxiety as well of what the future held if she didn't become the queen. One of the other things is that there was the shattering, and this I think is often forgotten about, but this was not, yes, she became the queen, but this was not a fairy tale, the rags to riches, the lady of low estate meets the prince or the king, and all of a sudden, this isn't a Hallmark movie, okay? For some reason, many Hallmark movies involve princes that meet common ladies and stuff like that. This is far from it, okay? Yes, she became the queen, but this wasn't a loving marriage, all right? Remember, this king, her now husband, was the very same king who very easily dismissed her wife and cast her aside when Vashti decided not to present herself before his party guest at the very beginning of Esther, all right? So this wasn't a fairy tale dream. So in all this, Esther had to pretty much give up any dream she probably had that I'm pretty sure many young women today and even back then in the Bible times had, of a loving marriage, building a loving family, and having a husband that loves and cares for her, okay? Remember, in our passage that we read, when we get further into the book of Esther, yeah, she was the queen, but she was scared to go before the king because he hasn't even seen her in like months, or at least a month. Husband of the Year award right there. So yes, she was the queen, but these were not ideal circumstances. These were not like the fairy tale dream. So yes. Oh, another thing is that she had to hide who she was, okay? She was a Jew, and it must have been very hard for her to hide her identity as a Jew, as a God-fearing woman from her husband and many other people, especially Haman, many other people in the palace as well, okay? Yes, Esther was a queen, but she did not have an easy life. She was orphaned, she had instability, she had the fear of what if she didn't become the queen. She had the fear of her own life later on when she discovered Haman's plan to kill her people. So things were not always great, even for Queen Esther. But through all this, as we're going to get into, we're going to see God's goodness still show forth. See, grief can make us feel weak. And Esther, at any one of these moments throughout her life, could have felt helpless or could have just shrunk into the background. And she may have felt to do that in our passage today, where she, was like, well, I don't know if I can just go before the king. She could have easily just hid in the background, but she didn't do that. See, by its very presence, grief implies we are powerless to change what brought that grief into our lives. And that's what many people feel when they're going through that. Yet Esther also had God, whose power was far greater than her own. And you need to understand, believer, when you go through your own seasons of grief, yes, you don't have the power to overcome this or to correct this or to make up for this loss, but God does in your life. In our times of grief, we need to have the reminder that even when we are weak, God is able. He will not allow anything to happen in this world or in your life that he will not work for your good and his glory. And God's sovereign power means that his promises, they're not empty. When he says, I will never leave you nor forsake you, you can take that to the bank. It does not mean he will not keep his promise. Our second point under God is in control is that he's not only powerful, but he is good. See, God's sovereignty is a tremendous comfort to Christians, but only when we remember that he is also good. All right, I mentioned that earlier. If he was just simply in control, he could be a far off, aloof being, but no, that's not our God. He is a great high priest who understands and he feels and he knows the pain that we go through. He's not unfamiliar with our infirmities and the things and the tragedies that we go through. See, God's goodness God's goodness is what makes his sovereignty a supreme comfort. All right, it assures us that the losses in our lives are not just random chance, but are filtered through a loving God, therefore our good and his glory. So it is as we remind ourselves of God's goodness and power and choose to trust in him that we experience the comfort of his sovereignty. Our second main point in our session today is that God is working behind the scenes. One of the fascinating aspects of the book of Esther is that God's name is not mentioned once. Now, although God is not seen or mentioned, we do know that he is at work, and nobody who reads this book can come to any other conclusion than that God was at work through all of these separate events. If we assume that God is not at work in grief simply because we cannot see him, well, then our grief only compounds and becomes greater and heavier in our lives. But Esther's story reminds us that God is always providentially working in our lives, even when we cannot see his plans. All right? That's what living by faith is. Living by faith is not living by sight. It's trusting that God is not only able to do what he promised, but that he is faithful to do what he promised. So let's think about some of the supernatural providences that happen throughout the book of Esther. All right, and you're gonna see me look down a lot here as I read these, but many of you guys who are familiar with the story, and like I said, read through the book, you're gonna see these as well. So one moment of divine providence is that God placed Mordecai in the right place to hear, remember that the assassins plan, those people that wanted to kill King Ahasuerus. And because God providentially placed Mordecai in that situation, well, that led to other future events. Like he, later on in the book, when when Ahasuerus could not sleep, what does he do? He reads the Chronicles or has the Chronicles read to him, and it's brought up to his remembrance, oh, this guy Mordecai saved my life. Did we do anything for him? And this leads to one of the more comical aspects of the book of Esther, when Haman, who's ready to come in and enact his plan to wipe out the Jews, mistakenly thinks that Ahasuerus wants to honor him, all right? And actually, in turn, it is that Ahasuerus wants to honor Mordecai, who at this point was like the biggest thorn in Haman's side. That alone, those sequence of events, is just one of several events of God's providence shown throughout the book of Esther. When Mordecai, if any of these things happened in a different order or did not happen, could have led to the death of Mordecai far before the death of the rest of the Jews as well. So yes, God is at work behind the scenes, and in our lives as well, he is at work behind the scenes even during our times of grief. God assures us that his plans are not only different than our plans, all right, his purposes, but they're higher than ours. All right, they're better and incomprehensible at times to us. I think of Isaiah 55, where it says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, saith the Lord. Neither are my ways your ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." So what does this all mean during our times of grief? Well, what it doesn't mean is that when you're going through a season of grief, you need to try to figure out why God's allowing this to happen, try to work out and guess what his purposes are in it. No, don't do that. But what it does mean is that we can and must purposely choose to trust God during our times of grief. All right, we know he's behind the scenes. We know he is faithful. He's powerful. He's in control, and he's good. Trust in that good God. Now, this all leads to our last point. Remember, God is in control. God is working behind the scenes. And lastly, God has a purpose for you in this moment. And our first point in this, understanding God has a purpose for us in this moment. And Mordecai tells Esther, hey, maybe for such a time as this, all right, this is why you were placed as queen. Well, the first thing we need to do is reject despair. expressing grief in times of loss is a normal thing. All right, we talked about this in our first session. Don't think that if you feel down, if you're being weighed down by your grief, that for some reason means you lack faith in God or you're not a very good Christian at the moment. No, it's a very normal human thing. Okay, but expressing grief or feeling down during these times of loss is one thing, but fully giving into despair and giving up, that's another. Now, in our passage, Mordecai, he hears of Haman's plan to annihilate the Jews, and what he does is really what is a very ritual-like thing with the Jews is he goes forth in front of the king's palace, in front of the king's gate, covers himself in sackcloth, covers himself in ashes, and he cries out and he laments this great tragedy that's going to happen to his people. Now, yes, he's expressing his grief, but he's also doing this to get Esther's attention as well, because she doesn't want anything bad to happen to him. But Mordecai's grief during this moment, it wasn't fatalism. He wasn't like giving up in despair, like, hey, there's no hope, okay? That is a place you don't want to get to. Expressing grief is one thing. Giving up hope, okay, is a different thing. That isn't what Mordecai was doing in this instance. See, although Mordecai felt and even outwardly demonstrated profound grief, he refused to despair, okay? Why? Because he trusted God. See, instead, Mordecai admonished Esther to, by faith, seize the moment and act, all right? He rejected despair, and when you go through your own seasons of grief, you're going to be tempted to just give up, okay? No, don't do that. Instead, like Mordecai, seek to take action, seek to trust in God and move forward. And that leads us to our second point under here, which is to walk forward in faith. So first we must reject despair, don't give up, understand we have a great, powerful God who cares for us, who has a purpose for us during this time of grief, and then walk forward in faith. Now, Esther's initial response to this whole tragic thing coming about, this news that Haman's trying to kill her people, was almost despair. It was helplessness. Like, what am I supposed to do? I can't just go before the king. I haven't seen him in like over a month, and we all know about the whole rule. Like, if she was to go forward when the king didn't call her and he was to, thumbs down almost, so to speak, then she could be killed. So unless he was pleased to see her, her life was on the line. And so she almost had a helpless response to the situation. But Mordecai, with a clear understanding of the situation and a very apparent confidence in God, urged Esther to seize this moment. And this leads to a very well-known phrase from the book of Esther, if you weren't familiar, where it says, maybe for such a time as this. And he says, hey, don't think you're going to get away with this. Don't think because you're the queen that you're going to remain safe. It's going to come known, it's going to come out that you're also a Jew and you will also perish. But I also love Mordecai's response here that, yes, he's trying to admonish and get Esther to take that step and take the lead and for such a moment as this. But he also understood that if Esther just continued to seclude herself in her helplessness, to give into that despair instead of rejecting that despair, he still said, you know what? I know that God will still deliver us, because he understood not just that God was good and powerful and in control, but he understood and remembered the promises of God way back at the beginning of the Old Testament to Abraham, how he would, hey, you are my people, all right? I will establish you as a great nation, and I will keep you as my people. So obviously God was not going to allow Haman to succeed and wipe out all the Jews. So if Esther wasn't going to step up to the plate, Mordecai had faith and trust in God that someone else would step up to this plate instead. Now, thankfully, as the story goes along, we understand that Esther does take that step of faith. And she does it in a very smart way, all right? She says, all right, I'm going to do this, but I need you guys to pray for me, all right? She understood that this was a big thing, and she definitely needed the power of God behind it. See, Esther did as she promised. After prayer and fasting, she approached King Ahasuerus, and then God pulled back the curtain to the work he had been orchestrating behind the scenes all along. See, the rest of the book of Esther reveals the amazing deliverance God brought through the intricate workings of his divine providence, all the way to the point that even the gallows that Haman made to hang Mordecai was used to hang himself instead. See, but what was the moment that opened this curtain, that showed Esther how in the end God was working all these things for their good? It was her choice of faith. She took that step of faith, she went before the king, and she was able to enact her but plea for the salvation or the saving of her people. One of the best ways to find refuge in God's sovereignty is to use the free will God has given us to take a specific step of faith. And often our greatest step of faith is seen in the daily choices we make to trust in the sovereignty of God. Anyone that's going through a season of grief, there's not one momentous, step of faith they can take like Esther did in our passage today, but oftentimes it's just simple steps of faith that they need to choose to take every day instead of sinking into despair. And those steps simply could be, hey, praise God for who he is. Okay, praise God for his goodness, his power, his sovereignty, and trust in him. Another step of faith is to pour out our hearts to God, including the pain we have, and express our trust in him, to pray to God. Guys, during seasons of grief is the greatest time to have a good, vibrant prayer life, or to build one instead. And another step of faith we could take is to persist in fulfilling just our regular responsibilities, getting up, making our bed, going to work, but also in worshiping God. Be regular in worshiping God, not just at church, but every day of your life. Those are simple steps of faith a grieving person can take throughout their times of grief to help grow and eventually see the goodness that God is working behind the scenes. So, in conclusion, as we finish up this session today, and I really wish we could just dive into Esther, and it's an awesome book. All right, it's an awesome book. But let's understand this. During grief, all of us have a tendency to look more to our suffering than to God. But when our focus is on our pain instead of on our God, we lose the comfort that comes into our lives when we rest in his sovereignty and move forward in faith. So in review, remember this. When it comes to resting in God's goodness, understand that God is in control. He's powerful. He's good. God is working behind the scenes, and God has a purpose for you in this moment. Hope you guys were able to get everything you needed in today's session. Do be faithful in doing the devotions, and I'm glad that many of you guys are doing these things together. Keep each other accountable. I'll see you guys next week. God bless.